White played a3, possibly unnecessary. I continued knight c7, and now white broke with e4. This threatens the positionally crushing e5, so I had to stop at that with f takes e4. White continued knight g5, and I played bishop f5, and he captured the e-pawn with the knight on g5. Knight g takes e4. I continued queen d7. After queen e2, I exchanged on e4, knight takes e4, white recaptured with the knight, and now I broke on the queen side with b5. This is a typical break in the Clarendon court. It often activates the rook on a8 along the b file. White responded very badly here. He went knight d2. This awkward little move prevents the development of the bishop on c1, and I continued just rook f7, preparing to double on the f file. White now wants to play b3, but there's a problem in that the bishop g7 would capture the rook on a1. That explains the ugly looking move rook a2. It's preparing to go b3. I played b takes c4. White recaptured with the queen. And now I exploited the problem that white has along the diagonal a2 to g8 by playing the move e6. This is another typical pawn break in the Clarendon court. You get rid of your weak backward pawn on the e-file and attack the white centre. It doesn't often happen, but when you can get it in, it's useful. Here, white can't capture on e6, because after bishop takes e6, there's major embarrassment for white. Look at his silly rook on a2. Instead, he played b3. I captured on d5, e takes d5. White had to capture back. He went bishop takes d5, and I captured on d5 with the knight, and white captured with the queen. Now, black has the two bishops, and more important, he has the bishop on f5, which is controlling the white squares, which are very weakened. I continued rook e8. White played bishop b2. I played bishop e6. And white played queen back to d3. Now I tried to attack with bishop h3. White went rook d1. And I doubled on the e-file with rook f e7. Black has a clear advantage in general terms in this position, but in fact white now blundered and allowed me an instant finish. He played bishop takes g7. I played rook e1 check, fairly obvious move. Now white has to go knight f1. But I think the move he'd overlooked here was simply bishop takes f1. When after queen d5 check, king takes g7, rook takes e1, rook takes back on e1, white is just completely lost. He went queen d2, and I simply played queen e6, and white resigned. He's a piece down, and there's hardly any defence to the mate along the back rank. Not a particularly good game by white, but it's typical of just how badly even quite good club players will play when faced with a new and original situation, which is exactly what you give them when you play the Clarendon court. In conclusion, I think these lines where white plays positionally with g3 are quite okay for black. He gets a a serious weakness on e6, but usually this proves to be inaccessible, and black can develop active piece play. Typically in these positions he castles, plays queen e8, and he can look to play either b5 or possibly h6, g5, and queen h5, with something of a kingside attack. Probably the sharpest and most aggressive white choice is to play 3 knight c3, knight f6, and now 4 bishop g5. There have been 3 all-grandmaster clashes starting with these moves, which just about makes it the main line. Actually, in practice, you may find that a greater number of white players choose to play positionally with g3, the move we've just looked at. But anyway, after 4 bishop g5, black's big idea is to go queen b6, and then there is a parting of the ways. White can offer the b-pawn with queen d2, he can defend it with rook b1, or he can play the immediate bishop takes f6, which was Laputian's choice when Tukmakov punted the Clarendon Court. Dave Norwood has also played this move against me in Blitz. This move saves worrying about whether or not black is threatening to capture on b2, since black replies queen takes f6. Now Laputian played 6e3, but in his notes to the game, Tukmakov suggested that 6e4 would be interesting, without giving any further analysis. Seems to me that after e4, f takes e4, knight takes e4, black can play queen takes b2, and if rook b1, queen d4 is fine. Black's probably better. Another idea is to play 6 knight f3. This was Dave Norwood's consistent choice in several friendly blitz games. After 6 g6, white continues e4, black takes, f takes e4, white recaptures, knight takes e4, and if queen takes b2, 9 rook b1 is very dangerous since white gets a big lead in development. After a couple of setbacks with this, I graduated to the more sophisticated g5. White played e4, and after g4, 8e5 loses a pawn to queen g7, since when the knight on f3 moves, say to d2, black can simply play queen takes e5 check. If instead white plays 8 knight d2, black plays d6, and after e takes f5, bishop takes f5, white can play bishop b5 check, to which black plays with another typical move of the Clarendon Court, king d8. Sometimes the king can be quite safe on the c7 square. I think black's doing fine in this position. He has active play with the 2 bishops, and, well, it's a very double-edged game. Returning to the Laputian-Tukmakov game with 6e3, black played g6, which is in fact inaccurate, since it allows white the option of playing d6 himself. But it didn't matter, since white played bishop c4, and black sorted out the problem by playing d6. This is what he should have done last move, when it's very probable it would have transposed back to the game. After 7 bishop c4, d6, 8 knight ge2, black should not play bishop g7, since then white would play knight f4, and if black plays knight d7, white can play knight e6. Tukmakov realised this. He played the more accurate knight d7, so as to meet knight f4 with knight e5. Black's fine in this position. He exploited the 2 bishops to win a good game in 50 moves. The old ECO recommendation is 5 rook b1, and the new move now is to play h6. In this position, Pettersson played 6 bishop d2 against me when we played in Sicily in 1994. Afterwards, he admitted that the move g6 by black now would give him a comfortable Dutch-type position, probably comfortably equal. However, in typical Clarendon Court fashion, I'd gained over half an hour on the clock, and I was feeling a bit too ambitious. Instead of g6, I tried e5, and after e4, I made another mistake by taking on e4. I should have played f4 instead. The game continued knight ge2, bishop e7, knight g3, I castled, and white played the move knight f5. And I lost a horrible game in 28 moves, and I'm not going to show it to you. Anyway, it's clear that bishop d2 isn't a move to worry about, since black can reply g6 with a fine position. Instead, white should play bishop takes f6, when black replies with queen takes f6, and white plays e4. Now black should play d6. I think the position's just very unclear. Black has the two bishops, but white has a slight initiative, and also e6 is weak, as is traditionally the case with this opening. It's very double-edged. Probably more critical is Lev Albert's choice of 5 queen d2, which leads to similar positions, so let's move on and look at that. It's a brave move, since white has to worry about black taking the pawn on b2. Actually, I decided this was a bit too risky. You win a pawn, but white gets the initiative. Instead, I played the move h6. White captured on f6, and black recaptured with the queen, not ruining his pawn structure. White now castled queenside. Instead of that, he could try the move e4, in which case black would take, white would recapture, knight takes e4, and now black can take on b2. And after rook d1, black plays d6, white can try the tricky little move queen e2. This threatens the rather cute knight takes d6 check. However, black can sidestep this in typical Clarendon Court fashion with the even sneakier move king d8. I think black's doing rather well here. Anyhow, after white's choice of castle's queenside, I played d6. White then went e4. Now white's got to react a little bit violently here and try and open up the position before black's two bishops become a serious factor. White's chances of advantage lie in a quick development. I played g6. The move g5 would have been another option. White continued bishop b5 check. And again, black has probably three options here actually. He could play either bishop d7 or king d8, which is interesting as usual, or the move I played, knight d7. After e takes f5, the game continued queen takes f5. White played bishop d3. I retreated with queen f7. White now tried a subtle move, knight b5, to which the only reply is king d8. There we are again. White played knight f3, black replied bishop g7, and white brought his last rook into the game, rook h e1, and black played rook f8. It's an interesting position. The black king is in the centre, but the two bishops are very important, and white's options are limited. He has very few ways to bring his pawns into play. He's got to do everything with pieces. He played king b1, and I played g5. Probably it was better to play a6, in fact. After 16 rook e4, I played queen f6. You've seen the threat, I hope. On b2. White played c4. Now I played queen f7. Now you may wonder why I've played queen f6 and then back to f7. Well, the reason was to force the move c4. This may seem a peculiar objective, but in fact it takes the square away from the white knight. After a6, knight a3, c4 would have been a nice potential square for that knight. Also the bishop on d3 is blocked by the pawn. White played rook d e1, and I used my key square on e5, knight e5. Moves like g5 prepare to secure the square e5 for black. White captured, knight takes e5. Black recaptured, bishop takes e5. Now, it would have been possible to sacrifice the exchange. The position would be completely unclear after rook takes e5. However, white played more positionally with f3, and I prevented any future possible sacrifice by playing bishop f6. From f6, the bishop defends the weak pawn on e7. Black's still got the two bishops, and quite a compact position now. White tried to mix things up by playing rook e6. This puts the rook on prise, of course, but it would be very risky to take it, since the white squares would suddenly become dangerous pathways for the white pieces to leap into action against the black king. I played b6, and white played bishop e4. This keeps leaving this rook on e6 on prise, and in fact it stays on prise for a hell of a long time, and I don't take it. Instead, I played bishop d7, just continuing my development. White played queen d3. I replied a6. White now played knight c3. This is probably a mistake. I think black's better after this move. Instead, queen a3 would have been completely unclear still. After queen g7, knight d1, I played king c7, white played g4, and now I played rook fb8. This is preparing the typical advance on the queen side with b5. Black's two bishops are now very solid. For a long time it's looked as though black has been defending, but now it's clear he has a big attack brewing. White played knight e3, and now it would be a mistake to take on b2 since e7 would be very loose. I played b5. White played queen a3. And now, in some time trouble, I started to lose the thread. Black should just play a5, building up this big attack. Instead, I initiated a tactical sequence with bishop takes b2. Now it's obvious enough if queen takes b2, black will play b takes c4, and the b file is decisive for black. But white played the better move, queen a5 check. I played king c8. Now the move I'd overlooked, king c2. Quite an easy move to overlook in time trouble. Now if I play b4, trying to bring my queen into the attack, white can just ignore it with knight f5, queen c3 check, and now king d1. The queen and bishop alone can only chase the white king to safety on the king side, and meanwhile black's king is in danger and e7 is falling off. So I played bishop f6, a defensive move looking after e7. White continued the attack with knight f5. I played queen f8. White now played bishop d3. This uncovers both rooks attacking e7 now. Finally, I played bishop takes e6. That rook's been on prise there for 12 moves. That might be some sort of record for an ongoing exchange sacrifice. White recaptured, rook takes e6. And I tried to simplify now with queen d8. White realised he shouldn't exchange queens and retreated, queen e1. And in return for the exchange, white has a real attack here. I played b takes c4, and I was banking on the variation knight takes d6 check, which would be a mistake. Black recaptures on d6, e takes d6. White can now win the black queen with rook e8. But black gets a fantastic position after c takes d3 check, king takes d3, bishop e5, when he'll have two rooks and a bishop against a queen and a completely won game. Instead of that, white played the excellent move, knight takes e7 check, which I'd completely overlooked. I have to capture back, bishop takes e7, and now a sort of quiet move, bishop f5. Now I have to run with my king. King c7, only move. Rook takes e7 check. King b6. a4. And although I've messed this game up, turning a one game into a completely unclear position, it's probably still equal before my next time trouble blunder, which was the horrible move queen h8. The only move instead of that was to play a5, which would have been unclear. Now white can play a5 himself, and indeed he did. a5 check, and I had to resign, since if I play king b5, bishop d7 is checkmate. This was actually the stem game renewing interest in the Clarendon court. Defeat cost me over $500, but the game was so interesting and spectacular that I hardly noticed. From a theoretical point of view, white needs to find an improvement in the chaotic early middle game, since as it went, black definitely got the advantage. Now, to give you a complete repertoire, we have to consider white's options other than 2d5. We'll deal with the least intimidating ones first. If 2e3, black has a whole range of moves. He could play g6, e6, knight f6, or just c takes d4. All of these are perfectly okay. Probably the most dynamic of these options is 2g6, when it looks as if white was terrified of the king's Indian or Benoni, and has chosen a passive line to avoid them. After 2g6, if white plays 3d takes c5, black just plays queen a5 check, and after 4 knight c3, he can simply recapture on c5, queen takes c5. More normal would be 3 knight f3, when black plays bishop g7, and white plays c4. Now if you play 4 knight f6 here, you'll get the sort of stodgy position your opponent is aiming for, judging by his play so far, that is. As usual, I'm going to recommend something more interesting. You can capture on d4, 4 c takes d4, white recaptures with the pawn, 5 e takes d4, and now black plays d6, the most flexible move. And the plan is to pressurize d4 by developing the queen's knight to c6, and the king's knight via h6 to f5. Notice the way this takes advantage of the move order, in that black has not already played knight f6, and can go the other way. A typical continuation might be 6 knight c3, bishop g4. This is consistent with the plan of attacking d4, since it pins one of its defenders. White plays 7 bishop e2, and you simply continue knight c6. And here, if white plays 8 d5, you can try bishop takes f3, white recaptures, bishop takes f3. Now you take control of the good square d4, knight d4. I think black's fine in this position. For example, after 10 bishop e3, you capture on f3, white recaptures with the queen, queen takes f3, and now black can even try bishop takes c3 check, white recaptures, b takes c3, and black plays queen c7. This attacks the pawn on c4. White can play bishop d4, then you just reply f6. May not look pretty, but white's pawn on c4 is a dreadful weakness. Going back to the position before white tried d5, another sensible option is bishop e3, defending the d4 pawn. Now you play the knight manoeuvre, knight h6, aiming for f5. In this dynamic and lively position, I think black has fully adequate chances. For example, after castles and knight f5, the pressure on d4 is already serious. If white plays d5, you take on f3, bishop takes f3, white recaptures, bishop takes f3, now you take on e3, knight takes e3, white recaptures, pawn takes e3, and then you play knight e5, and white's position is strategically lost. He has a bad bishop on f3, hemmed in by his own pawns. Black has an unopposed dark squared bishop and a superbly placed knight on the invulnerable square e5. Inevitably, white's going to lose a pawn. If white plays 2c3, well, try not to yawn. It's very quiet and absolutely no danger theoretically. At the Lloyds Bank Open in London 1994, Demis Hassabis played this way against me. The game continued 2e6, white played knight f3, black developed normally with knight f6, white played bishop g5, I played h6, white retreated with bishop h4, I played knight c6, and after e3, I exchanged on d4, c takes d4, white recaptured with the c-pawn, and I played queen b6, not worrying about the possible doubled pawns on the f-file if white should play bishop takes f6. White played the move queen c1, and I continued d5. The Position's about equal, in fact 1 in 35 moves, but I don't think it's very relevant to Clarendon court theory to go into it any further. As you can see, white hasn't achieved anything in this opening, and black's got no reason to fear this sort of setup. In the New York Open last year, one of my opponents tried 2 knight f3 against me. After taking on d4, c takes d4, white recaptured with the knight, and black played d5. White has already moved his knight twice in the opening, and black has every prospect of establishing a strong pawn centre. For example, after c4, black can play e5, since knight f3 is met by d4, and there's the old trick: if knight takes e5, you play queen a5 check, winning a piece. Instead of c4, white may simply play g3. Then you carry on as planned: e5, knight f3, and black plays knight c6. This is just the sort of position I was talking about. Black's good pawn centre gives him at least an equal game, probably a slight advantage in fact. Another move 2 choice for white is to d takes c5. Now black can get the pawn back with a comfortable game with e6. There is one line you should look at though. 3 knight c3, bishop takes c5. Now white plays knight e4. White's trying to get the bishop pair here, but he loses too much time. Black just plays knight f6, white captures on c5, knight takes c5, queen a5 check, neat little trick that, queen d2, queen takes c5. Now white can try and swap the queens off with queen g5. In fact, the Encyclopedia of Chess Openings reckons this may be slightly better for white, but I don't agree. I think it's fine for black. Queen takes g5, white recaptures on g5, and now, improving on b6 given in ECO, black can play d5, and I think his position is just fine. The most enterprising alternative to d5 is definitely 2e4, trying to transpose into a Sicilian defence. If you play the Sicilian anyway, you've got absolutely nothing to worry about. But for the purposes of this repertoire, I'm going to assume that you know nothing about it at all, and that you're not prepared to learn it. After 2e4, c takes d4, you have to know how to handle 2 possibilities. After 3c3, you get a Mora gambit by transposition. You have to take d takes c3, and after knight takes c3, I'm going to recommend a simple and clear way of playing this for black. Knight c6, knight f3, d6, bishop c4, e6, white castles, black develops the bishop, bishop e7. The secret to this system is to remember to delay the development of the king's knight. This takes the sting out of the Mora completely. After queen e2, black goes a6, white plays rook d1, now bishop d7, you're planning to play rook c8, white goes bishop f4, now you play e5, white plays bishop e3, and finally knight f6. And because of black's move order, he has a comfortable position. If the knight was on f6 earlier, white could have played the bishop to g5 without losing time. The other option for white is to play knight f3, aiming for an open Sicilian. But black can avoid mainline theory and exploit the strange move order in either of 2 ways. One is to play 3a6, with the idea of 4 knight takes d4, e5. Now, in the normal O'Kelly Sicilian, after 1 e4, c5, 2 knight f3, a6, white can avoid all this and play the simple move 3c3. But with this move order, black doesn't have that problem. The other line, which I would play myself, is 3e5. Spot the trap. If knight takes e5, black has queen a5 check. Whoops. The best move is 4c3. And this time, if you take on c3, white gets a good Mora. But black plays 4, knight c6. And this is actually quite an active move. The main idea is that after 5 pawn takes pawn. Black replies e takes d4. White goes knight takes d4. And black plays knight f6, attacking the e4 pawn. After knight c3, black plays bishop b4, with active piece play. White cannot both defend e4 and leave black with a weak d-pawn. I think it's about equal after 8, knight takes c6, d takes c6. Instead of taking on d4, white can try the interesting move 5 bishop c4. It's already on the edge of theory. My own analysis goes knight f6, and now white has two moves. If he goes c takes d4, black recaptures, e takes d4, white plays e5, black has the good move now d5, with a slight advantage in my opinion. Or, after 6 knight g5, black plays d5, white captures, e takes d5. Now black shouldn't capture back with knight takes d5 because of queen f3. Instead he plays knight a5, and after bishop b5 check, bishop d7, queen a4, I think the best move here is b6. Now white can capture on d4, c takes d4, black recaptures, e takes d4, and if white castles, black just plays bishop e7, and if bishop takes d7 check, black can take back with the knight, knight takes d7, and he has absolutely no problems. Even if you don't play the Sicilian, I think you've got absolutely nothing to worry about. These lines seem fine for black. In my opinion, only 2d5 represents a real threat. The above analysis is enough to turn the Clarendon Court into a complete repertoire against 1d4. So there you have it. You now know practically all the theory there is, and you've seen most of my home analysis too. I hope you're feeling confident enough to give it a try. There are several positive factors to encourage you. It has real surprise value, it completely disorientates opponents, so you should gain plenty of time on the clock, and it will probably be several years before it becomes mainline theory, so throughout that period you'll have a knowledge advantage over every new opponent that you play. I think it also makes an excellent alternative to safer, sounder openings, like the Queen's Gambit declined, orthodox defence. It may not be as positionally sound, but there are far better winning chances. Besides, you should get more interesting and original positions to play. Good luck with the Clarendon Court in your own games.